Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on your time zone. Thank you so much for joining us for this hour for our virtual event, a book talk featuring the author of Stalin, Passage to Revolution by Professor Ronald Suny. This is a real treat for us for a number of reasons, not only because we consider Professor Suny to be part of our own community, very selfishly, but also his insights into Soviet history, nationalities issues, systemic issues really are unmatched. And so it's a real honor and a pleasure to introduce him. My name is Alexander Cooley. I'm professor of political science, and I'm the current director of the Harriman Institute. So our conversation today will proceed along the following lines. Professor Suny will offer about 20-25 minutes worth of reflections. I might ask a couple of follow-up questions, and then if please do get involved, ask a question using the Q&A function in the Zoom that you have, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. Just by way of introduction, Ron Suny is the William Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan and Professor Emeritus of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. He has many, many books prior to this one, and they include They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide from Princeton, and The Soviet Experiment, Russia, the USSR, and the successor states. And he's joining us today from Ann Arbor in Michigan. And then just one other note, Professor Suny was also featured in the oral history that the Harriman Institute undertook a few years ago. And you'll find that, we'll post a link to that in the chat. So if you want to read about Professor Suny's own formative experiences in Georgia and in other places and how he came to be the distinguished scholar that he is, please check that out and have a look at that. So Ron, thanks so much for joining us. Congratulations on the book. It's a magnificent achievement. And thank you for taking the time to share some of your formative experiences with it and some of its arguments.
Thank you, Alex. It's always a pleasure to work with you and Harriman, my old home, when it was the Russian Institute, way back when, with Alex Dallin and Zbigniew Brzezinski. These are historic times. I go way back. The book I wrote, it's a great big book, as you saw from Alex holding it up, is very worthwhile reading, or even if you don't want to read the whole thing, just keep lifting it up and you'll build up your upper arms. It's really worthwhile just having physically. Well, I began that great big book on Stalin with two preliminary epigrams, followed by a well-known dialogue between Trotsky and the old Bolshevik Smirnov. So let me read those, because in some ways these three items tell us what the theme of the book is. It begins with Dmitry Volkogonov, the general who was allowed first into the archives and to, in fact, look at things that no one had seen before in the history of Stalinism. And he wrote the following: "No one can be regarded as a born criminal. One cannot look at Stalin in the same light in 1918, in 1924, or in 1937. It's the same person, and yet it's not. In the 10 years after he succeeded Lenin, he changed markedly. Yet that is the difficulty of creating his political portrait. While apparently struggling for the ideals of socialism, however twistedly he understood, he committed crime after crime." Unquote. And then I have a small, short Russian proverb: "Do not expect more from the truth than it actually contains." In the spring of 1924, Stalin's nemesis and rival, Lev Trotsky, told the old Bolshevik, Vladimir Smirnov, I quote, "Stalin will become dictator of the USSR." "Stalin?" Smirnov reacted. "But he's a mediocrity, a colorless non-entity." "Mediocrity, yes," Trotsky mused, non-entity, no. The dialectics of history have already hooked him up and will raise him up. He's needed by all of them, by the tired radicals, by the bureaucrats, by the nepmen, the kulaks, the upstarts, the sneaks, and by all the worms that are crawling out of the upturned soil of the manured revolution, unquote. Well, Trotsky certainly had a way of words, and he would pay for that later, and Stalin would see to that. So this book that I've written, and I sometimes call this talk Living and Working on the Young Stalin for Over 30 Years, Why Bother? This was a long time coming. And I first am going to tell you why I decided to write it. I have done much of my work, and Alex has told you this, as a historian of the South Caucasus, what we used to call Transcaucasia. And I was particularly interested in the Russian Revolution and the non-Russian peoples. I had painstakingly studied not only Russian, but Armenian and Georgian at a time, I think Alex might be too young for this, but a time when serious scholarly attention almost exclusively focused on Central Russia, the Kremlin, even the Lenin mausoleum to find out who was standing next to whom, and very few people, except maybe nostalgic and narcissistic nationalists, were paying any attention at all to non-Russian peoples. So I wanted somehow to draw my fellow historians, political scientists, other scholars, maybe even a broader public, to look seriously at the region in which I had spent so much time. And the way to do that, appeared to me, was to look closely at the early life of the best known and most important modern figure to emerge from Transcaucasia, namely Joseph Stalin. Now, beside the region and its cultures, another interest, which I bet those students, maybe they're out there, that I taught at Oberlin College or University of Michigan or University of Chicago, Stanford, will also know, a very serious interest of mine has always been Marxism, especially the damaged and distorted history of Russian social democracy, and particularly Bolshevism. So Stalin was the vehicle, the MacGuffin, the gimmick to get people to look, and by which I could open up what I considered obscured histories. So was it worth it all that time? Absolutely. Did I feel that I had found things that surprised me? Absolutely, repeatedly. And I'm going to share some of those things with you. I'm going to try in the brief time I have to talk about three important things. I want to talk first about Stalin himself, that is Soso Jurashvili, who became known as Koba, an underground revolutionary, and then emerged as Stalin by 1913. I want, secondly, to talk about Bolshevism and Menshevism. I'm not sure how much of this I can get, but maybe in the Q&A. Its costs, its consequences for Russian and Soviet history, and a kind of revisionist view that I've developed, because much of the history, including when I was at Columbia working under Leopold Heimsen, was basically about a resurrection of Menshevism, the more democratic and moderate part of social democracy, and in some ways the demonization, which was appropriate in the Cold War years, of Bolsheviks and Lenin. So I wanted to look at that very closely. And then I might have time at the end to give you an overall arc of the early life, which, by the way, was more than half of his lifespan. And then what that might tell us, because Alex is interested in this, about the post-revolutionary life and how the dreams of an emancipatory, democratic, socialist revolution became the nightmare of tyranny and socialist autocracy. So I begin with a warning, because Stalin's early life has been always more than a biography. There's wonder at his achievement. How did a son of an abusive father and even mother, a cobbler, ascend to the heights of world power? How did he become the architect of an industrial revolution, the destruction of millions of people he ruled? Let's not forget also the leader of the state that stopped the bloody expansion of fascism that ended the Holocaust with the liberation of Auschwitz and saved the world for capitalism and liberal democracy, achievements that we don't often remember and attribute to the Soviet Union. How did this particular vision of socialism, which so many socialists in the West, from Trotsky to social democrats, rejected, how did it become so tightly identified with the Soviet experience so that all of Russian history, if not the Soviet period, can be reduced to Stalin, the purges, the Gulag, or at the present time, that rather dour policeman, Vladimir Putin. Those of us who study this world and are fascinated by it and live in it and have lived in it are trying to show something deeper, more textured, more complicated, perhaps. Well, particularly elusive and less explored by many of the biographers of Stalin, except in the rather fantastic and adventuristic biography by Simon Sebag Montefiore, but not so much by Kotkin and some others, has been Stalin's early years, before he was Stalin. And of course, we try to read what he was later, the demon dictator, back into the earlier life. I used to be a fan when I was a kid of the Landmark series of biographies. Every kid in this biography presaged, previsioned what he would become. So Christopher Columbus, boy explorer, or Florence Nightingale, girl nurse, you know, or my favorite, I was from Philadelphia, John Wanamaker, he's the founder of a department store, John Wanamaker, boy merchant. This creepy little kid used to sell his used toys to his friends at a profit. So this fellow, Soso Jurashvili, began in the streets of Gori, which was his first school, a rather rough academy indeed. His father may have been abusive, but what we have from memoirs is actually that it was his mother, more than anything else, who actually beat him. But he loved his mother. His mother was maybe dogmatic, but was absolutely ambitious for young Soso, encouraged him and made him go to a religious school in Gori and then on to the Tiflis seminary. She wanted him to be a priest. And as the famous tale tells, in the 30s, when he told him, Mama, Deda, I am something like a czar, she said, oh, that's interesting, Soso, but I'm sorry that you never became a priest. In fact, that ambition and that drive and the fact that he succeeded in school and in the seminary are key to his further evolution. That seminary is so interesting because it probably produced as many revolutionaries as it did priests of the Georgian Orthodox Church. It was a kind of Jesuitical, at least that's the way Stalin told it in the most negative possible way you can imagine the Jesuits, was fiercely, nationalistically, chauvinistically Russian. It denigrated Georgians. And so Stalin's first, if you call it radical experience, was as a Georgian nationalist, as someone who was promoting Georgian music. He was a great singer. He was called Bullbull Nightingale. He was a romantic poet who was fiercely promoting, and his poems were published in the Georgian press in the 1890s for Georgian liberation. But soon enough, he came through another school, very importantly, because there were secret underground bookstores. There was this other university that he went through, which was the Russian humanistic intelligentsia traditions, which are also about human emancipation. And they influenced him. And eventually, because this movement was peculiarly dominant in Georgia at the time, he became a Marxist. Marxism answered all of the problems of his situation: a poor provincial, a victim of empire. He was both oppressed by class, by provinciality, and by nationality. And Marxism, which promoted in its Georgian version, which eventually became Menshevik under Neue Jordania, proposed a liberation movement allied with Russia, so that was very important, but which would both attack the bourgeoisie, which was Armenian in Georgia, and the autocracy, which was Russian. So he joined the movement. He became an underground revolutionary, an outlaw. He went through 1905, 1907, a searing experience, because if there was any place in the empire where the cruelty of the regime came down, it was on those peripheries in Poland, in the Baltic lands, in the Caucasus. And that's where people like Alichanov Avarsky led expeditions, punitive expeditions, Karachany Expeditia, against the villages, and destroyed them, burning them to grounds and hanging people at will. That was the experience he grew up with. He himself was what we would call a terrorist. He formed a jigupi, or a group, that in fact carried out assassinations and even helped initiate a spectacular robbery in the center of Tiflis. He went through a series of cultures, and that's what I try to show in this book. Not so much that the child is the source of the man, though clearly it's the same person, but that the cultures he goes through, Georgia, the seminary, the intelligentsia, the Russian Social Democratic Party, the underground, exile, all of these things, including the identification with the Bolshevik wing, are formative in what he became. And what I try to show at the end of the book is that there is a general arc to what Stalin became. He moves to the Bolshevik wing. He admired Lenin enormously. Because of all revolutionaries, Lenin was the most militant, and Lenin celebrated the important role of social democrats. This is often translated as the role of intellectuals, intelligenti, but in fact, if you read what is to be done very carefully, it's that social democrats would bring the Marxist wisdom to the working class. That is, worker social democrats and intellectual, intelligenti social democrats. And who better fit that bill than Koba from the provinces, son of a cobbler, who had all the toughness and all the disdain for those real intellectuals, those wavering figures who Lenin despised, actually, but was ready to do what a hard, and hard was a key word for Bolsheviks, were prepared to do. So Lenin, in fact, promoted Stalin, brought him right up into the Central Committee, and got him in 1913, just after he adopted the name Stalin, in fact, to write the key text, or one of the key texts on nationality policy, Marxism and the national question. And then Stalin was a member of the Central Committee. He was carrying out important duties for the highest figures in the party, but he was fingered by another Central Committee member, Roman Malinovsky, who Lenin trusted, also another worker Bolshevik, who was in fact a secret police agent. And so Stalin in 1913 went into exile and stayed there in the harshest parts of Siberia until the revolution liberated him in 1917. Now, I would argue that Stalin, like most successful politicians, was a practiced performer. He learned to play numerous roles as he moved up the Bolshevik hierarchy from provincial poverty to state power. That journey was a harsh educational odyssey, but skills were required and acquired as the hard experience of this outlaw life toughened him. So the major theme that I try to develop is what I call the erosion of empathy and the creation of an instrumentalist, Machiavellian, pragmatic figure, often the centrist, not the splitter who's driving people out of the party because of dogma like Lenin. He becomes that more in the post-revolutionary years, but someone who was always concerned with praktik, with the practical aspects of an organizer, and he was a good organizer within Russia. Knowing his beginnings, Stalin grew up with models of a weak, irresponsible father and a strong, principled mother. His father was a failure, particularly in Georgian terms. He never really became a true Katsi, as we say in Georgian. He never had the support of a close and loving family, as did Lenin. And therefore, what he did as a kind of surrogate family was bring close comrades around him who were always tested for their loyalty and their utility. And if you notice that, it starts in the book with people like Kamo and others, and extends into the 1920s when he gathers around him close comrades, many of them from the Caucasus, like Ordzhonikidze, Mikoyan, Sergei Kirov, Mikhail Kalinin, and even Voroshilov, all somehow connected to that part of the revolutionary world. Revolution was his profession. And through his work in the party underground and with workers in Baku and St. Petersburg, hardened by the violence of 1905-1917, and his suffering in prison and exile, he arrived in 1917 as a man who had ideals, but these ideals, this emancipatory part, had already been closely identified with his own personal career. Sentimentality had largely been suppressed, empathy had eroded, a Machiavellian calculus, discipline, toughness, violence, even cruelty were requirements in this bitter political battle. Always remember that Marxism is a bizarre amalgam of utopian notions, of romantic schema that you can find in Lenin's State and Revolution, let's say, or in the Gotha program, or in many other parts of the tradition. That combined with a pragmatic understanding that those people in power, the autocracy or the bourgeoisie, will never give up their privilege, their property, their power without a fight. And so in order to win power, and Marxism here is indeed a theory of war, it's a theory of class war. And Lenin, and Stalin adopted this view, knew better than anyone by 1917 that revolution is not a political campaign. It's not about winning a majority. It's a war. It's a war of position. And it's a war in which you have to have the right people in the right place at the right time, namely, primarily men with guns. That's how they took power. In 1917, in October, there was worker support in the city of Petrograd, certainly. But even more importantly, Lenin and Stalin understood, there were those who hesitated, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, that the moment was ready to strike. And that Leninist notion that there's rules of the game in revolution, which are very different from rules of the game in democratic politics. I hope my political science colleague Alex will agree with this thing, though. There's a real difference between democratic politics, which are about compromise, concessions, negotiation, deliberation, give and take, and you don't ever checkmate the king. Whereas war is about destroying your enemy and establishing a new form of revolutionary power, eventually something called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, Lenin and Bolshevism saw politics as an extension of war. That is, in some ways, reversing Clausewitz. So war is the extension of politics. For Bolsheviks, politics is the extension of war. And Michel Foucault, in fact, argues the same way. That's usually the way it is in democracy, except maybe with the Republican Party in America, but that's another story for another time. So I'll end with this, that Stalin, yes, may have been a mediocrity, as so many politicians are, but he was not a non-entity. And indeed, history had hooked him and pulled him up with the help of Lenin, his own experiences, the Bolshevik underground, and one should not forget his innate talents. Thank you.
Ron, thanks so much. And you bring up a number of, I think, really fruitful areas for discussion. But one, I would like to give you a few minutes to place the book within this or I would even say kind of ecosystem of other Stalin biographies that you have out. And you've written on this before. A version of this is included in the book. Actually, we have a question from Charles Smith, who explicitly asks you, how does your book relate to other biographies of Stalin, such as Deutscher's? But how, in particular, do you perceive the sort of evolution of kind of the psychobiography approach, then the kind of Cold War approach, and then maybe if you could say a couple words sort of contrasting your approach with that of Steve Kotkin, who is the author of the other contemporary biography, and his approach, which emphasizes more both the kind of bureaucratic milieu in which Stalin is and the geopolitical milieu, as shaping him into the man making these tough, hard-nosed decisions. And I think that that kind of genealogy and that contrast would be of great interest to our viewers today.
That's a really good and big question, and I have a kind of appendix which tries to discuss some of those biographies. So I think of my own experience. So I grew up first with the Deutscher biography, right, and was very sympathetic to it. Here was a Trotskyist, a Marxist, who was ready to tell the story in a certain way, and though he was anti-Stalinist, he took Stalin very seriously, maybe was almost too generous to Stalin in some ways. And then the next biography that one came to was Robert C. Tucker's, 2 volumes. He got through 2 volumes. And the first one is absolutely, deliberately a psychobiography using the psychology of Karen Horney, a post-Freudian. And I decided very early on in discussions even with Bob Tucker, whom I knew, that I would not do a psychobiography. It wouldn't be Freudian. Now, you can't do biography without investing in psychology. But I came from a different angle and thought, I'm going to talk about contexts, cultural environments, milieu, which he went through and how he shifted. So rather than a kind of organic continuity, there are much more ruptures in this biography, right? As he moves, as he changes, as situations change. So the revolution will be important. And if you want to explain the 1930s, you've got to see this is not the same guy that he seems to be in 1925 in NEP. So how do we explain those things as well, right? Of course, there must be continuity. And of course, there must be the same person, but something is developing, changing, shifting, as we might realize from our own personal experiences over time. We're not the same person that we were in another context, right? With Steve Kotkin's, which is a really excellent book, and I've written reviews on it, he doesn't take the earlier period that seriously. Montefiore, who does look at the early Stalin, he has a book called Young Stalin, in fact, doesn't take Marxism, the national question, seriously. One time I met Montefiore and he asked me, well, what are you interested in? I said, well, I'm interested in the revolution, the labor movement. I'm interested in, social democracy. He said, oh, good. I'm interested in his women. So if you're interested in his women, then go to Montefiore and you'll find a Stalin who's not only a bandit, a gangster, a terrorist, but a pedophile. I took Stalin very seriously. I took Marxism very seriously. He was a journalist for much of his career. He wrote dozens and dozens of articles in Georgian and in Russian. And he wrote on the national question. So I was trying to follow all of that. Why did he break with the Mensheviks? When Mensheviks took over Georgia, he had to leave. He went to Baku and then later to Petersburg. So he made a different kind of career. Those things were important to me, to take these things very, very seriously and to see how he maneuvered through these things. So there's a lot of context, maybe too much context, but I think when you put the figure in that larger environment, it comes out clearer in a funny way.
That's great. I think the follow-up to that, and thinking a lot about, your book and some of the others out there, is, the achievements and the reputation and the infamy of the subject of a biography inevitably seems to become the real object of explanation in some ways, right? And it's in the case of Stalin, who I think you rightly call at some point, the world's most powerful man, but also someone who inflicted such systemic cruelty in so many different domains and time periods, and it strikes me that getting at that inevitably shapes some of the choices that you make in the book, right? About what it is you want to amplify, what it is you really want to delve into. And maybe that wouldn't be the case if you're looking at another sort of leading Soviet figure. So maybe talk to us a little bit about your view of Stalin, the question of violence, repression. Of course, you have written books on genocides, other books on genocide. So it's something that you have confronted head on in your career. Talk to us a little bit about your thought process, and maybe, to push this maybe a little bit further, some of the kind of, ethical considerations you think about when you sort of weigh some of these explanations and this whole endeavor of trying to explain someone like Stalin.
People like us, Alex, and many academics come from a kind of humanistic tradition. So it's very hard to deal with some of these questions. I would say my angle is that politics, not just revolution, but politics is kind of tragic. There aren't optimal choices. There are harsh choices to make. And revolution only exaggerates those, only emphasizes those. And the Bolsheviks were willing to take those risks, and the very ideas and the very practices which they engaged in. Some would say they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to, eliminate the Constituent Assembly. They could have dealt with other parties better. Maybe that's true. But they had a certain mindset, and the combination of their own perceptions and the real tough situation and choices they had led them in a certain direction and made them victorious ultimately, right? Whereas other parties disappeared, essentially. So it's within that context, it seems to me, that you have to look for the answers as to why violence. So not so much in the personality, it's there. Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin were willing to use terror during the Civil War. Lenin was not willing to carry terror into the peaceful period of NEP. That is, we move in a different direction. There, a more representative figure of what Lenin would have been had he lived beyond 1924 was probably Bukharin. That is, the Leninist road to socialism was about cooperatives and convincing the peasants and examples, not a war against the peasants. Stalin went the other way for pragmatic and practical reasons in a moment of crisis in 1928 and declared a war against the majority of the population. And then other things follow from that. And once you have the instruments of power and no institutional limits of any kind, or even personal limits, it seems, who knows what follows. And what Stalin did was bring the violence that we saw in the Civil War into a period of peace. He had destroyed all his enemies. He had eliminated all his enemies. There was no real opposition to Stalin after 1924. And yet he used the police and the army that he had to destroy first old Bolsheviks and people close to Lenin, and then massively, ex-kulaks and others in the campaigns that we've learned about since the archives opened a couple of decades ago. If I lived long enough, which one never can tell, right? If things happen, but if I did, I would write a second volume, but I wouldn't write a full biography. What I would like to do is write a history of the next 7 years. That is October 1917 to the death of Lenin, the period of the Civil War. Because I think that was formative, absolutely formative in what made the Soviet state. The Soviet achievement, the Bolshevik achievement in creating a state, as any political scientist would understand, in the moment of civil war, international intervention, absolute economic collapse is unbelievable. And they did it. They didn't make a democratic state, but they made an effective state that could then take power by a minority over a mass peasant population. They, in the words of Stephen Holmes, they built a ship at sea, in a turbulent sea. Gorbachev, of course, had all the instruments of power at his hands, but he wanted to have a democratic state. And we know the result of that story, not one that any real Bolshevik might have appreciated.
So on this topic, I want to go to one of the questions we have from YouTube, which is a follow-up question from Jim Dingaman. Could the Bolshevik Revolution have been possible if the Russian army had not collapsed in February 1917? As an add-on, much is made of the dispute Stalin had with military commanders during the Civil War. How does an examination of Stalin's pre-1917 period give us insight into these matters?
So first question is about, about 1917. There's the state, the czarist state, a 300-year-old plus monarchy, collapsed in a few days, with first women coming out on the streets, shaming their men workers to come out in the streets, and then an insurrection, a rebellion, we all know about insurrections nowadays, became a revolution when the army went over to the crowd rather than defending the regime. That's the key moment. So this pragmatism, this understanding about the importance of force, power, violence is absolutely central to Lenin's understanding of the revolution. And eventually, after a brief moderate period in February and March of 1917, where he lines up with his close friend Kamenev, who of course he will destroy in 1936, Stalin moved into the Leninist position. So clearly the army is key, one way or the other. The army collapsed. We have two wonderful volumes by Alan Wildman about the Russian army in 1917. They're so brilliant, they'll last forever, right? The army collapsed. And in its wake, and in its inability to defend the country against the Germans, there was a power vacuum, an incredible power vacuum. But the garrison in Petersburg went over to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were not a majority party, but they had the men with guns in the right place at the right time. Workers in Petrograd largely sat out the October Revolution, but the Red Guards and the garrison did not. They backed the Bolsheviks. So again, this lesson of revolution as war is key to the way in which people win in such situations. When they don't act that way, think of the Italian Communist Party in 1920, 1921, when they had militant workers from below ready to act, no real Bolshevik party, and they hesitated. Who in fact marched on Rome? Not the left, the right. Lenin acted decisively. Leninism was, and this is also in Stalin, a kind of much more voluntaristic political Marxism than the kind of Second International, sleepy, deterministic, fatalistic, just wait, the revolution will come any minute now, it's around the corner. I mean, they started a new tradition. And Stalin, given his personality and where he came from, his experiences earlier, he bought into that very, very rapidly.
Very interesting. Let's change our focus slightly. So this is a question on the chat in the Q&A from Meggy Kartsevadze, who thanks you for your interesting presentation as always, and asks about Stalin's own nationality policy. To what extent do you think his Georgian past influenced his nationality policy? Specifically, do you think that his attitude towards Georgian nationalism was to some extent different from his approach to other Soviet ethnicities?
Thank you. Thank you, Didit Matloba. That's a very good question. So I'm going to say a few things about Stalin and Georgia. First of all, in my book, I do not argue that there's some kind of essential, fixed, bounded Georgian culture, just as there's no such thing for Armenians or Azeris or even Russians, right? Stalin was a creature who grew up in a Georgian milieu, highly orthodox milieu from his mother, and he appreciated its poetry, its language, very much so. And apparently he was a very good writer in Georgian. I'm not able to, I read Georgian, but I'm not able to judge the nuances of the language. And he loved the music as well. So he was Georgian in that cultural sense. But Georgia moved away from him. Georgia became Menshevik, identified with a kind of socialist national approach. And he deliberately left, being abandoned and in some ways being expelled by the Menshevik movement, and joined the Russian movement, and identified far more with Russia and with a multinational social democratic movement than with any that was infused, as his earlier commitments had been, with a single nationality. So there's no ancestral Georgian culture. He was operating in a situation where people were debating, what is Georgian? How Georgian are you? As we often do in such ethnic cultures. His Georgianness and his expertise as a national expert was an ascribed identity. It was given to him by Russian Bolsheviks, by Lenin. Oh, you're from the Caucasus. Oh, okay, you must know about this. And therefore he got that job and eventually was People's Commissariat of Nationalities. You know that when he was People's Commissariat of Nationalities, he hardly went to any of the meetings of the Commissariat. He wasn't that interested in that, even though it was a fairly important position. And eventually it was dissolved. He definitely identified, particularly in his public and political life, with Russia, with the Soviet Union. He was a statist. He was an etatist, and not so much with his nationality. But there were private parts of him. He had a kebab chef, a Georgian kebab chef, when he was in power. He liked khvanchkara and kinzmarauli and different Georgian wines. And he often spoke Georgian with some of his closest comrades, though he often didn't as well. Because in Bolshevik culture, if you were Jewish like Trotsky, or Polish like Dzerzhinsky, or Georgian like Stalin, you identified with a non-ethnic, non-religious, multinational, social democratic culture, which eschewed, which effaced many national aspects.
Very interesting. And I think that probably also gets into some of the real problems in contemporary Georgia of how do you account for Stalin, and how do you engage with him, and how do you, narrate his history and put him in the museum there in Gori. Question from Dato Lagidze, who says, why did Stalin oppose Mensheviks and leave for Baku? Maybe you could say a little bit about Stalin's time in Baku and some of its support.
Yeah. There does seem to be a trace in Stalin of anti-authoritarianism, in the sense of, I can't take orders from certain older men like Neue Jordania or the views of Georgy Plekhanov. And the only one he seemed to admire in that position was Lenin. So very early on, as a young kind of revolutionary, Stalin is already criticizing and poking at some of the leaders in the Menshevik party. Jordania talks about this, and others mention it as well. And he's sent off from Tbilisi, to Batumi, where he leads a strike movement, which is then shot upon by the czarist authorities, and it's quite a disaster. And then he goes into exile. So that's his first attempt at revolutionary leadership, and it's a disaster. When he escaped from his first exile and came back to Georgia, he had to go through a test. People were suspicious of him, and they made him write a credo, a view of his position vis-a-vis Georgia, nationalism, and so forth. And he still appears as a kind of Georgian Buntist, still too nationalist in his thinking. And he criticizes that, and he becomes more interested in the general, more multinational movement. But still, by 1907, Georgia is completely in the hands of the Mensheviks, of Jordania and his close comrades. the former Mesamedasi group, the intellectuals of the Marxist movement in the 1890s. And so he leaves and goes to Baku, where you have a multinational movement, largely Russian workers, some Armenian workers, very poor, as they called them then, Tatar, or what we would call Azeri workers, and abandons basically Georgia. He takes his first wife with him, a Georgian woman. She becomes ill in Baku from the heat and the pollution and dies. And he famously says, "My heart has turned to stone. I have no feelings anymore," at that point. And maybe that was also another kind of milestone, that exception, that cutting off from his Georgian heritage.
Great. So now I want to move to a question from Stephen Usitala, who asks, what were Stalin's first real intellectual influences in terms of socialism when he was in Tiflis? What specific writings most shaped him? And then just maybe to link to a broader question from Leah Tadoa, how do you think Stalin understood the country he built, given the fact that it didn't seem to reflect Marx's ideals?
The second is easy but he simply changed Marx's ideals. That is, he declared that what they had in 1936 in the Soviet Union was socialism, right? That's it. So, the one-party state, fake elections, 1936 wonderfully democratic constitution, all of those things, no market economy of any sort and so forth, all of those things that represented socialism. He just made that up. So he was, let's say, flexible in his Marxism. Now, one should take his Marxism seriously. It is a kind of frame or lens through which he understood the world. Marxism was Stalin's sociology. That's how he understood social and political forces. And it has an influence. But it also, and he mentions this in his own writings, something that had to be interpreted, reinterpreted, fit the facts. It wasn't a dogma. He made Marxism into a dogma in the short course, as David Brandenberger has shown. But in his own thinking, Marxism was much more tools that could be used, and he took them very seriously. His early experience in Tiflis, in the seminary. So in the seminary, he and some few other Georgian students began reading pamphlets, whatever they could get their hand on, and they would copy them out, with great diligence. Late in the evening, and they would be sometimes very popular things. They also apparently found some works of Marx as well, pamphlets or parts of books and things like that. And they also apparently, though I was a little suspicious in my book about this, read Darwin. There are so many accounts that reading Darwin eliminated their faith in religion. Now, it seems a little too pat. It's too often referred to, but there seems to have been some influence. In other words, the temper of the times, the atheism of Marxism, the influence of Darwin in the popular sphere, those kinds of things seem to have created. But he also was influenced, as I mentioned, by the humanistic traditions of Russian literature, by the humanistic traditions of Georgian literature, the work of Alexander Razbeki, very important. The book Koba, the patricide, out of which the romantic revenger hero Koba comes. These are all things that influence this impressionable young man.
Great. Next to Schorler Neuhauser, who has a specific question. Can you comment on the influence of the events of the 1905 Gurian Peasant Republic on Stalin's own development as a revolutionary bandit?
This is so interesting, the Gurian Rebellion. Imagine this, already starting in 1923, peasants in Western Georgia, in a province we call Guria, began to develop a widespread social, political movement against the local landlords, the petty nobility that existed in that area. That movement was very influenced by Stalin's own failure in Baku in the 1902 strike, which led the czarist government to exile many of these workers who had participated in the movement to their home villages. And so the virus, oh, that's a bad word here, or the germ of revolution went from Batumi, from these workers, into the villages. And you see this accelerating movement to the point that by 1905, you have something called the Georgian Republic. The Tsar's mandate no longer, his writ no longer ran in Guria. It was like an independent area, but it was led by Mensheviks, not by Stalin. Stalin was gone by that time. He was in Tiflis. He was on his way a couple of years later to Baku. What's interesting about this Georgian movement is, as far as I can tell, along with maybe something like it that was going on in Finland, the Georgian peasant movement and the Menshevik movement in Georgia was the first time in history that Marxists were so deeply involved and even led, though they did not initiate, a peasant movement. Now, later in history, in Asia, in Vietnam, in China, and elsewhere in Africa, peasants and Marxism would go together, despite what Marx himself had predicted and thought. But Georgia seems to be the first place. So when the Mensheviks actually take power in 1918, in May 1918, and they stay in power until February 1921, when they're overthrown by the Red Army, by the Bolsheviks, they form a democratic republic. They're socialists who are leading a bourgeois democratic institution with the full backing of the peasantry as well as the working class and even elements of the middle class.
Terrific. Just screening through them. I have another one here from David Leopold, who asks, would you agree with the idea that Stalin's worldview was ironically stronger informed by humanist organic categories, trust, loyalty, betrayal, than Lenin's possibly more sober mechanical understanding of society, and that this may explain paradoxically his turn to inhumane violence? And then, as a note, far more important than this, was Stalin half Armenian?
Stalin was Georgian. He wasn't Armenian. He wasn't Ossetin. He was Georgian. It's very interesting that some people want to take credit for him and others want to get rid of him. So they try. But, nationality or ethnicity is a matter of culture, the way you're brought up, the languages, your own self-identification. Stalin always identified as a Georgian in terms of his ethnos, of his nationality in that sense, nationalness. Yeah, and David's question is a very good one. It's a complicated one. There is I don't want to, again, reify or essentialize cultures, but there's a lot of discussion and discourse and thinking and writing in the Caucasus about things like trust and betrayal and honor. And I try to discuss that very much in the book without saying, okay, this is what all Georgians think. This is an honor and betrayal society or something like that. No, it's not like that. But it does function in the way people represent themselves and the way they think about these things. And what I try to say in the book is, friendship depends on trust. But trust, when it fails, can lead to an exaggerated sense of betrayal. And you do find that in Stalin. So he's always looking for loyalty. He has no family really that he can depend on. So it's these imagined communities of friends that he has to create and utilize in order to move ahead. And he's very exploitative of them, as he is with the Armenian revolutionary Kamo, who's very faithful to him. But again, when trust is betrayed, let's say by Bukharin in the late 1920s, when he goes into the cave and meets Kamenev, Stalin doesn't forget that. As Solzhenitsyn once said, suspicion was his ideology.
Great. Let's see if we can take a couple more. There's an interesting one here from Levon Kalandarishvili, who asks, what do you think about Stalin's creature, the ZSFSR, presuming he means the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, as a peace-building model in the South Caucasus?
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, I remember once in the mid-1990s going to Armenia and giving a talk about Caucasian culture, trans-Caucasian culture, how we're all related in some ways, how we've shared cultures together. And I was almost driven out of the country, and I was called in Armenian Davajan, which means traitor. So there are imagined communities like Transcaucasia, and there are more powerful imagined communities like Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, which in fact were the creatures and the creations of those solid identities of Soviet nationality policy, of the legacy of Leninism. So that's the reality. Somehow, in 1922, they did try. Lenin was less in favor of it, but Stalin was much for it. This Transcaucasian Federated Republic. There'd been an earlier attempt before the Bolsheviks came to power, but it was very sort of jerry-built. It was very artificial in many ways. And ultimately, in 1936, Stalin divided it. Now, my own preference, I'm an American. I live in a federal state for all of its advantages and disadvantages. And I believe that we have to move beyond these kinds of national state of sovereignties. We have to think more creatively of how power can be shared, can be divided in various ways. I'm not saying we go back to the Middle Ages and feudalism, but we ought to think that maybe we've gone beyond the nation state. This is a big topic, of course. Maybe this idea of sovereignty is leading to, what has it led to? Ethnic cleansing, forced assimilation, and as my own work shows, genocide itself. We've got to think in other ways about how to deal with multinationality.
And I think we have time for one more. This one's going to come from Raphael Kachaturian, who asks, what responsibility does Stalin bear as commissar during the Bolshevik defeat in the Polish War and ultimately of advancing the revolution westwards?
You're forcing me to go into the period after I
Yes, he mentions that. I'm not sure if this is too far into the future than Professor Suny wants to discuss, but we're here to showcase your range as well.
I see. Okay. My range a few years ahead of the story, right? Well, the story there is very interesting, and you can find it in Kotkin and in some of the other biographies as well. That is, Stalin and had his own idea of what he wanted to do during that war. And there's pretty good evidence that he may have damaged the overall thrust toward the Vistula. And so I haven't investigated that as a primary topic, but if I ever get to write that other book, I certainly will try to do that. And maybe Raphael will help me with some sources if he knows any.
Well, because you're so quick, we're going to squeeze in one more. From Oliver Reisner, according to my research, the Georgian Marxists were marginalized amongst the Georgian intelligentsia in order to overcome their peripheral position that had to turn peasants as allies. What do you think about that?
I would put it this way, and Oliver is a good friend of mine. He knows these subjects very well. Georgian Menshevism, Georgian Marxism was the de facto national liberation movement of Georgia. They had support in all levels of the population. They largely marginalized the classic nationalists like Ilya Chavchavadze. This, they're not highly regarded today in today's Georgia, though there are younger people who are promoting it. But in general, their support was amazing among workers, among middle-class elements, the intelligentsia, and once they reached into the village, thanks to efforts by people like Grigol Uratadze, they became a massive, infallible movement. They won all the Duma elections, many of the Duma elections, and they became the leaders of the Republic. An extraordinary achievement.
So, Professor Suny, we are at time. You have covered just tremendous ground. This has been such a pleasure for me and for our community. Let me remind everyone, the book is Stalin, Passage to Revolution by Princeton University Press. Just a remarkable achievement. Good luck to you with it, with the other book tours, and hope we can see you in New York soon. It's been too long, and we can't wait to host you and delve into this and all of your great projects.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone at home. Stay tuned for more of our events at the Harriman Institute. Please sign up for our list if you haven't done so. Bye, everyone. Stay safe.